Life in the medieval period was uncertain. You could die from a bad tooth, a cut could fester and kill you in a week. Childbirth was a massive risk for both mother and baby. Famine could sweep through a region, leaving nothing. And war was a constant threat. Your village could be fine one day and a pile of ash the next. People felt powerless. They lived in a world they didn't fully understand, where invisible forces seemed to be in charge. And these forces were very real to them. God was real, his power was absolute. But so was the devil. Demons, spirits, and angry ghosts were not just stories for scaring children. They were believed to be active agents in the world. A sudden illness wasn't just bad luck, it could be a demonic attack. A crop failure wasn't just poor weather, it could be a witch's curse. The world was a battlefield between good and evil, and ordinary people were caught in the middle. Faith was the main shield. The church offered salvation, sacraments, and a structure for understanding this chaotic world. Prayer was the first line of defense. People prayed constantly. They prayed for health, for a good harvest, for protection on a journey. But prayer felt distant sometimes. It was a request sent up to a vast, busy heaven. People wanted something more. They wanted something they could touch. This is where amulets and charms came in. They were a physical form of hope, a tangible piece of defense against a world of invisible threats. It wasn't about replacing faith in God. For most people, it was part of it. It was about bringing a little piece of that divine power down to earth, into their homes and onto their bodies. It was a way to feel a little less helpless. An amulet was an object you wore or carried. It was meant to ward off evil, disease, and bad luck. A charm was often a spoken or written formula, an incantation, or a ritual act. But the lines were blurry. A written charm could be folded up and put inside a pouch, turning it into an amulet. A special stone, an amulet by itself, might need a charm recited over it to activate its power. The two ideas were deeply connected. This need for protection was universal. It crossed all social classes. A peasant might carry a smooth river stone found in a specific place at a specific time. A king might have a sliver of the true cross embedded in the hilt of his sword. The materials were different, but the fundamental belief was the same. The belief that certain objects and words held power, that they could influence the unseen world and offer a shield against the endless dangers of life. It was a way of taking some small amount of control in a world that offered very little. It was a way to walk through the darkness with a small personal light in your hand. And this wasn't just a private matter, it was woven into the fabric of society. Everyone knew about these things. Your neighbor might have a special herb hung over their door to keep out evil spirits. The local blacksmith might know a charm to stop bleeding. Midwives had their own collections of amulets and rituals to help with childbirth. It was a shared language of belief. It was part of the common understanding of how the world worked. It was a response to the deep and constant anxiety of medieval life, an attempt to make the mysterious a little more manageable and the dangerous a little less terrifying. So what were these objects of power? They could be almost anything, as long as people believed it had special properties. The materials themselves were often seen as magical. They came from the earth, from animals, or from holy places. And their power often came from a kind of symbolic logic. What a thing looked like, where it came from, or what it was associated with determined its use. Natural objects were very common. Stones were a favorite. A stone with a natural hole in it, called a hag stone, was considered very powerful. You could hang it over a bed to prevent nightmares, or tie it to a stable door to protect horses from being ridden by witches at night. The hole was a magical doorway, a way to trap or filter out evil. Coral was another one. Its reddish-pink color and branching shape made people think of blood vessels, so it was worn by children to protect them from bleeding and illness. It was a piece of the sea, a mysterious place, and that gave it power. Gems were for the wealthy, but they worked on the same principle. Sapphires were thought to protect eyesight and calm anger. Amethysts were believed to prevent drunkenness. The toadstones were particularly strange. They weren't real gems, but the fossilized teeth of a prehistoric fish. But people believed they grew inside the heads of toads. Since toads were associated with poison, the toadstone was thought to be a powerful antidote. A person might have one set in a ring. If poison was in their food or drink, the stone would supposedly sweat or change color. Parts of animals were also used. A wolf's tooth on a necklace could give a person the wolf's strength and courage. It could also protect against wolves, a real threat in many parts of Europe. A bear's claw served a similar purpose. The logic was simple: carry a piece of a powerful predator to gain its attributes or ward it off. Feathers from certain birds, the foot of a mole, a bit of dried bat's wing, all found their way into amulet pouches. It sounds strange to us, but it made perfect sense in a world where the lines between the animal and human spirit were much blurrier. Herbs and plants were essential. Some were hung in the house. Rowan wood was thought to be a powerful protector against witchcraft. Sprigs of it were placed over doors and windows. St. John's wort was another. It was gathered on St. John's Eve, the summer solstice, a time considered magically potent. It was worn or hung to drive away demons and evil spirits. People would also carry small bags or pouches filled with a mix of specific herbs. These were personal amulets, each blend tailored to a specific need, like safe travel or finding love. Then there were the written charms. Words themselves had immense power, especially if they were written down. The very act of writing was a kind of magic to the majority of the population who were illiterate. A piece of parchment with a prayer, a string of holy names, or a mysterious-looking symbol was a potent object. The Seder Square was a famous example. It's a 5-line palindrome where the words can be read forwards, backwards, up, or down. Nobody is sure of its original meaning, but it was considered a powerful protective charm against fire, sickness, and witchcraft. It was carved on church walls, scribbled on bits of paper, and worn in lockets. Finally, there were the objects connected directly to the Christian faith. These were the most powerful and socially acceptable amulets. A simple cross, made of wood or metal, was the most common. But the most sought after were relics. A relic was a physical object associated with a saint or with Christ himself. It could be a piece of bone, a lock of hair, a scrap of clothing, or even dust from a saint's tomb. These were not just symbols. People believed they contained a real, tangible piece of the saint's holy power. A tiny splinter of wood believed to be from the true cross was the ultimate amulet. It was protection of the highest order. Pilgrim badges were another form of religious amulet. These were small, cheap tokens made of lead or pewter sold at pilgrimage sites. A person who walked to Canterbury would buy a badge of St. Thomas Becket. Someone who went to Santiago de Compostela would get a scallop shell. These badges were souvenirs, but they were more than that. They were proof of a difficult, pious journey. People believed the badge retained some of the holiness of the shrine. They would sew them onto their hats or cloaks. It showed everyone their piety, but it was also a personal shield, a piece of a holy place they could carry with them back in the dangerous world. How were these things supposed to work? It wasn't always a clear system. It was a mix of religious belief, folk tradition, and what we might call magical thinking. For the medieval person, these categories weren't so separate. Prayer could be a kind of magic, and magic often used the language of prayer. It all operated on the belief that the world was full of unseen powers that could be influenced by the right words, objects, and actions. The power of words was central. A charm was often a spoken formula. It might be a simple folk rhyme passed down through generations. A charm to stop a bleeding wound might involve reciting a verse while making a certain gesture. The words had to be said exactly right. One wrong word and the charm would fail. This is why some people, often called cunning folk or wise women, were specialists. They knew the correct words and rituals. Christian prayers were often used as magical charms. The Lord's Prayer, Pater Noster, and the Hail Mary Ave Maria were considered incredibly powerful. People would recite them not just as acts of devotion, but as protective spells. They would write the first few words of the Gospel of John on a piece of parchment and wear it around their neck to ward off evil. The language itself, Latin, added to the mystique. Most people didn't understand Latin. It was the language of God, the language of the Mass. When a priest spoke it, it was holy. When it was written on an amulet, it carried that same mysterious authority. It was a divine code that demons had to obey. The names of God were another source of immense power. People believed that knowing a secret or powerful name of God gave you a measure of control over the spiritual world. Amulets were often inscribed with variations of these names, sometimes in Hebrew or Greek letters, to make them look even more arcane and powerful. The names of the three magi, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, were also very popular. They were thought to protect against epilepsy, which was known as the falling sickness, and was often believed to be a form of demonic possession. But it wasn't just the words. The object itself had to be prepared or activated. This often involved a ritual. A special stone might need to be found at dawn on a certain day of the year. An herb had to be picked while reciting a specific prayer. An amulet might be consecrated by a priest who would bless it with holy water. This official blessing by the church was the approved way. It put the object firmly on the side of God. However, many people use less official methods. A charm might need to be whispered over an object 9 times. Or an amulet might need to be passed through the smoke of a particular type of wood. The actions were as important as the words. This is where the line with magic became very thin. The church was always suspicious of these rituals. Blessing an object in God's name was one thing. Believing that a specific sequence of words and actions could automatically compel a result was something else. That was magic, and it was dangerous. It seemed to bypass God's will and put the power in human hands. There was also the idea of sympathetic magic. This is the belief that like affects like. To heal a wound, you might use a red stone or a red cloth, because red is the color of blood. To cure jaundice, which turns the skin yellow, you might use a yellow bird or a yellow flower. The idea was to transfer the yellowness from the person to the object. A charm to get rid of a fever might involve tying a piece of string around the patient's wrist, then tying that string to a tree. The fever would supposedly pass from the person to the tree. The church had a complicated relationship with all this. On one hand, it condemned magic and superstition. Priests would preach against using pagan charms. On the other hand, the church itself was full of powerful objects and rituals. The veneration of saints' relics, the use of holy water, the exorcism rite, these looked a lot like the same kind of belief system. The church tried to draw a clear line. If the power came from God and was channeled through his saints and sacraments, it was holy. If it came from some other source, or if it tried to force a result through a mechanical ritual, it was demonic. But for the average person, that line was very fuzzy indeed. They used what they thought would work. They would pray to a saint, but they might also carry a hagstone in their pocket just in case. It was a practical approach to spiritual security. People had a charm for almost every trouble they faced. Life was a long series of specific dangers, and for each one, there was a specific form of protection. These weren't general-purpose good luck charms. They were highly specialized tools for navigating the perils of medieval existence. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments in a person's life. Mortality rates were high for both mother and child. So, protection during labor was a major concern. One of the most common and powerful amulets was the birth girdle. This was a long scroll of parchment or vellum, inscribed with prayers, holy names, and religious symbols. It was physically tied around the pregnant woman's waist during labor. The belief was that the holy words would create a protective barrier, easing the pain and warding off any demons that might try to harm the mother or steal the newborn. Some of these girdles were owned by churches or noble families and loaned out to women in the community. Once a child was born, the dangers continued. Infants were seen as especially vulnerable to evil forces. They were often given their own small amulets. A piece of coral was a classic choice, tied to a baby's wrist or sewn into its clothes to protect it from the evil eye. The evil eye was the belief that a person's envious or malicious glance could cause harm, illness, or even death. Babies, being so perfect and praised, were prime targets. Amulets were meant to distract or repel that negative energy. Sickness and injury were constant companions. Without an understanding of germs, illnesses were often blamed on supernatural causes, a curse, an imbalance of humors, or a punishment from God. Charms to cure ailments were widespread. A toothache, a common and agonizing problem, had many folk remedies. One charm involved writing a specific phrase on a piece of paper and having the sufferer wear it. Another might involve driving a nail into a tree while reciting a verse, symbolically nailing the pain to the wood. Bleeding was another immediate crisis. People had charms they believed could stanch the flow of blood from a wound. These were often verbal charms, sometimes invoking the story of Christ on the cross, or other religious events where blood was a central theme. The person performing the charm would press on the wound while reciting the words, trying to magically command the blood to stop. Travel was fraught with peril. Roads were poor and bandits were a real threat. A person going on a journey, whether a merchant, a soldier, or a pilgrim, would want protection. Saint Christopher was the patron saint of travelers, and a medal or badge with his image was a popular amulet. It was a prayer you could wear. Herbs like mugwort were also used. People would put it in their shoes to prevent their feet from getting tired on a long walk. Love and relationships were another area where charms were used, though this was often seen as more sinister. A person might use a charm to make someone fall in love with them. This could involve creating a little effigy of the person, using knotted cords, or slipping a potion made of special herbs into their drink. This was considered manipulative magic, and the church strongly condemned it. It was seen as interfering with free will, a dark art that bordered on witchcraft. Even daily work had its charms. A farmer might use a charm to protect his livestock from disease, or his crops from blight. A fisherman might have a lucky object on his boat to ensure a good catch. A soldier or a knight going into battle had the most need for protection of all. Their armor might be engraved with protective symbols. They might have a relic of a warrior saint, like St. George, sewn into their tunic or even placed inside the pommel of their sword. Every little edge counted when your life was on the line. These charms and amulets show what people worried about most. They weren't abstract fears, they were the immediate, practical problems of staying alive, keeping your family healthy, and earning a living. Each charm was a specific tool for a specific job. It was a way of fighting back against a world that was often hostile and unpredictable, using the weapons of faith, tradition, and belief. It was a system of practical magic for everyday life. It's easy to look back and dismiss all of this as simple superstition. But these objects were much more than that. They were deeply social things. They connected people to their faith, their community, and their own identity. An amulet wasn't just a magical rock or a piece of paper, it was a statement about who you were and what you believed. For one, amulets were a visible sign of a person's piety. Wearing a cross or a pilgrim's badge was a public declaration of faith. The pilgrim's badge was especially important. It was like a passport of the soul. It told a story. It said you had undertaken a long, difficult, and expensive journey to a holy place. It showed your devotion, and it connected you to every other person who had made that same journey. When you returned to your village wearing the scalloped shell of Santiago, you were part of a special group. You had seen things and experienced a holiness that others had not. The badge was your proof, and it earned you a certain amount of respect. For the wealthy and powerful, amulets could be a status symbol. A noble lady might wear a stunning reliquary pendant made of gold and jewels. On the outside, it was a piece of high fashion. On the inside, it might contain a tiny thread from a saint's robe or a speck of bone dust. This object declared her wealth, her taste, and her profound holiness all at once. A king might have his crown or scepter embedded with gems that were chosen not just for their beauty, but for their protective qualities. These were amulets of state meant to protect not just the man, but the entire kingdom. Amulets also reinforced a sense of community belief. When everyone in a village hangs rowan over their door to protect against witches, it strengthens the shared understanding of how the world works. It confirms that witches are real, that rowan is powerful, and that we are all in this together. These practices created a common culture of protection. They were passed down from parents to children, from neighbor to neighbor. They were part of the local identity. The specific charms and amulets used in one region might be different from those in another, binding the local community together with its own unique set of traditions. But there was also a darker side to this. The line between a respected wise woman who knew healing charms and a feared witch who used curses was a thin one. A person's reputation could be made or broken by their association with this kind of power. If a charm worked, you were blessed. If it failed, or if something bad happened afterward, you might be accused of malice or of dealing with dark forces. The same object could be seen as a holy relic or a demonic trinket, depending on who was looking and what their motives were. The church was constantly trying to control this world of belief. It couldn't stamp it out entirely because the need for tangible protection was too strong and too human. So it tried to manage it. The church promoted its own approved amulets like saints' relics, blessed medals, and crucifixes. It tried to absorb folk traditions by baptizing them, turning a pagan festival into a saint's day, or a magical herb into a symbol of the Virgin Mary. At the same time, it fiercely condemned practices that it couldn't control. Church courts would investigate people for using forbidden charms or engaging in what they defined as sorcery. Over time, especially after the Reformation and during the rise of the scientific worldview of the Enlightenment, these beliefs began to fade from the mainstream. The Protestant Reformation, with its rejection of saints and relics, declared many of these objects to be idolatrous. The new science offered different explanations for illness and misfortune. Germs, not demons, caused disease. Bad weather, not a witch's curse, ruined the crops. The world became, in a sense, less magical. Amulets and charms were pushed to the margins, becoming the stuff of folklore and superstition. But they never completely disappeared. The human need for a sense of control, for a small piece of hope to hold in your hand, is too fundamental. People still carry lucky coins. Athletes still have rituals they perform before a game. People still wear religious medals for protection. The objects have changed, and the explanations have shifted, but the underlying impulse is the same. It's the same impulse that led a medieval peasant to carry a stone with a hole in it. It's the desire to have a shield against the uncertainties of the world, a tangible link to a power greater than ourselves. The medieval amulet was not just a mysterious object. It was a social tool, a marker of identity, and a very human answer to a very old fear.